And honestly, I was very proud of being Canadian. Yeah, like still to this day, um, I I'm so thankful actually for my dad
Right.
for having that perseverance and that foresight for his family, and he fought for that, obviously, as you hear, and so I've always loved this country.
Yeah.
I think honestly, I think Canada's after being because besides living in these different places, I've traveled lots around the world, and I still always when I return and set my feet on Canadian soil, I'm like, wow, yeah, I'm home, and and I and this is a wonderful wonderful nation, a beautiful country, and so I always think that, always,
Right.
like to this moment, always do. Yeah.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Immigrants of Canada. My name is Suzette Smith, and I'm here with my friend Gavin Howell. Welcome to the show, Gavin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here. I want to say first off, I really like your shirt. I noticed that there were zebras on it, and I think it's quite appropriate for the theme that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah.
So, Wales and Zambia.
Yep.
Which came first?
So I was born in Zambia. I'm a Zambian citizen, and so that was the beginning of my life, obviously. And we lived there for 5 years. And actually, my mother and father are Welsh citizens from Wales, and so they're not Zambians per se, but my dad took a job in Zambia, and so that's how I was born in Zambia.
Okay. Yeah. And so, being in Zambia, what did you relate to more? Is it Welsh culture?
Welsh culture.
Yeah. So did you relate more to Welsh culture or Zambian culture?
Very much Welsh culture. Like, so as we were we went to Africa, went to Zambia, because my mom and dad were still, and they were very young. Like my mom was, I think, 19 years old, and my dad was 21 years old. So they were young, and I was the third kid. So they'd already had 2 children, and I was the third, and my mom was still only 19 years old. So you can imagine what that would have been just like being that young and coming to a foreign land. So what happens is they moved there because my dad took a job. He was an electrician, not a missionary or nothing like that. He was an electrician, and Zambia was colonized by the British Empire.
Okay.
And so that's why that connect happened. And it was a copper mine up in the northern part of Kitwe, Zambia. And so when we got there, there was a lot of British citizens who also were there. And so as people tend to do, they congregate with their own culture. And
right.
so that was, so that's how we were able to maintain that Welsh or British culture, was because there were people there,
right,
from Wales, from Britain. Yeah.
Okay, so while there was this bubble, did that mean that you still had friends outside of the bubble, or was it you just stuck within your bubble?
Yeah, pretty much stuck within the bubble, because I mean, just as it was, there was different, demographics of like where you lived. So, obviously we didn't live in a grass hut, which right. Many did.
Yeah.
Just like I always remember, my mom describes it literally flying and landing in the town, and she was crying because she just couldn't believe that she was coming to this land, and all she could see was grass huts from up in the plain. And then, so, it's not like you had a Walmart on the corner or a superstore, grocery store, stuff like that. Very, very primitive.
Right.
And yet a city that was growing. But this is back in the late 60s. And so, so that, just as we began there, like as my mom began there, she had to grow all her own food. My mom became a seamstress out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
So she actually made all our clothes. Like I didn't even wear a pair of jeans, I think, until I was like 11 or 12 years old. Because
really?
my mom would make all of our clothes.
Okay.
So, so that's what happened to my mom and dad. They all of a sudden they had to be very resourceful.
Mm-hmm.
Because you just didn't have that commodity. You just didn't have that access
right.
to like clothing and textiles and building or renovating, all that stuff. Not really there.
Did your mom have to learn this all on her own, or did she know this prior?
Well, she was still young, right? And keep in mind, she had already, like, as we moved to Zambia, she'd already had 2 children who were both in diapers.
Mm-hmm.
So, she had her first one at 17, second one at 18, and I was her third one at 19. So I would say no, she didn't have those resources yet because she was still so young. Yeah. And so out of necessity came, invention, I guess. And so that's what she began to knit and sew and became honestly a seamstress. Right. Would make everything. And not as a business or nothing like that, like for the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your dad went to work, your mom was kind of the homemaker.
Yeah.
Did she end up getting a job at all, or just being a homemaker was her job?
Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely it, because another child came only another 2 years later, mm-hmm. and there was a miscarriage in between that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there was... so she just had a lot of children. Right. As a young mom, and so she couldn't have gone and getting a job or nothing like that. That was just part of.
Well, raising all these children is like a full-time job. Raising one kid is a full-time job. Yeah,
and I would say too, like as we grew up in Africa, we had a maid, and that may sound like it's. We were rich, but that wasn't the case at all. Mm. It was just that's actually how you would employ any people. If you needed help in your yard, if you needed a maid, then that they were actually quite the African people were very thankful for you hiring them to do that. So it wasn't as it was a level of aristocrat. It wasn't like that and servants. It was more like seriously out of necessity.
Mm. Yeah, that's wonderful though that you're able to help the community in that way. Yeah, giving people jobs. Yeah. And meanwhile, your father's working in the mines. You said.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Was he around a lot, or was he gone? Like, I don't understand how a mine job really works.
Yeah. So very much shift work. Like he was an electrician, so they'd go down into the copper mines, and so they would have 12-hour shifts, and there were. I'll introduce one thing that my dad was a drinker, so I'm talking alcohol, right? And so and that was very much the culture of Britain, of Wales. Like that was just pubs are on every corner in your neighborhood, residential, everywhere around. So it's very much a culture. So without sounding too forward, my mom raised the family. My dad brought the paycheck. Yeah. And honestly, that was a generation ago, or a couple generations ago, that's the way it was, I guess. And so even though he worked a lot, he also partaked in because they had a rugby team, they played rugby, the rugby club, so it was just drinking lots of that. And so I grew up with that. Mm-hmm. And as we get further into the story, this will continue.
Part 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So then you're a young boy and you're watching your mom do all of this. What were your thoughts as a young boy? Did you think much about this, or was it just kind of like, I'm just focused on what's in front of me, which is probably playing because you're a kid?
And really, I mean, I was in Zambia for 5 years, and it was just like, those, you're not philosophizing about these things of your childhood and stuff like that. You're just putting up with what's in front of you, and toys, play, and whatever, all that, whatever the climate's like. That's how you do that's how your childhood is, right?
Yeah.
I would say that. So I grew up, like, I had a lot of sisters. I have 5 sisters, and so no brothers, and so I was very much raised by a pack of women. and so and yet my dad would be there sometimes, but he worked a lot, and then also his extracurricular activities. So definitely it was my mom was the influence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, being, I guess, raised by a lot of women, you kind of develop this respect for them, I suppose,
yeah.
and you look up to them.
Yeah.
Your dad wasn't. It sounds like, to me at least, it sounds like he wasn't around.
Yeah.
A lot.
No.
And how did that feel?
As you grow up as a kid, anyways, the way I saw it was like, lots of times you don't unpack your childhood until you're out of your childhood.
Right.
And so when I look back on it, I would have loved to have my dad more.
Yeah.
But I also realized that he kept on, growing his family, having a bigger family. And so that just put more pressure to have that provision, have that, have the right job, it just costs lots of money to raise a family.
Right.
And so that takes up time.
Mm-hmm.
That the necessity of having that big family is like, I'm a father now, and I know that's okay, you got to make this happen.
Yeah.
And so that was my dad. He's good man, very good man. Like, and as we weave through this, I respect my dad, and but as we know, humans, we have trouble, we have problems.
Yeah. But
we'll walk through that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
first 5 years of life, Zambia.
Yeah.
And then what?
Okay, so then Zambia. And you know what? My dad says still to this day, he goes, "Boy, I would have never left Africa."
Really?
He would have never left. He says, like, he just loved the culture. He loved the relaxed part about in a hot land, hot country, and just wasn't a first world place where it was just work and get all your stuff. So he liked it. But my mom, and this will be a recurrent theme, my mom didn't want to live there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you do as a marriage, right? You and there was another factor too. Zambia became its own republic, so it became a sovereign nation. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, that colonization of the Brits being there was like, okay, time to leave. So that was a part of leaving as well. And so then once that 5 years was up, then we went back to Wales. And I mean, we went back. I obviously hadn't been there yet, but my mom and dad, that's where they grew up. They grew up in a little village in South Wales, and that's all my mom ever wanted, was to actually be back with her whole family. Her whole constellation, her whole family constellation was, within 10 miles of each other.
Yeah.
Like in the same village or, thereof. And so that's all my mom wanted. But then my dad he was just always saying, there's something better out there. There's an opportunity out there somewhere.
Yeah. And
so then we were in Wales, lived in Britain.
How long did you live in Wales for? And if you don't mind me asking, because I'm not too clear on this myself, what's the distinction? Because you said Britain, I just caught that. Yeah. So what's the distinction? Wales, Britain, Ireland, Northern Ireland. Can you kind of describe the differences and the distinctions between the borders?
You become a British subject, but you do have sovereign nations within Britain, so it's a Commonwealth. Okay. And so Wales is its own nation, Scotland is its own nation, Ireland is its own nation, and England is. Okay. But they're all under the British Commonwealth. They're all under the British Empire.
Right. Okay.
And so that's so I don't say I'm a Welsh citizen. I'm a British subject. That's actually what it says on my passport.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just it. Now each of those different countries have their own languages, have their own culture, their own independence, and so Wales being one of them. And so we lived in South Wales. We lived on the seaside shore, like on the ocean. And that's where the village was that my mom and dad grew up in, and then we ended up living there.
Mm-hmm.
So we lived in Wales for, I think it was about 4 years. 4 years now. Lived in Great Britain, in Wales, and so which was that was different, way different than Africa. I mean, you were coming to a different climate, you were a different food.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was coming, but then all of a sudden my family was huge. I had aunts, uncles, nans, grandpas that I hadn't seen ever, and wow, so this was pretty neat, right? And so really enjoyed living in Wales.
Yeah.
Very, very quaint, very, very rural, sheep farming, livestock, countryside, very nice. I felt very free as a kid. It was a safe place, a good place to live, and so enjoyed that. And then one day, my dad says, I got a job in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. It took us 6 months just to even spell that. And so then, he took the whole family and moved to Saskatoon. And so this is when I was 9 years old. And so do you want me to describe?
I was going to say, how did the family respond to this news? Because you've got Wales over here on this side of the Atlantic, and then you've got Canada over here, and no less Saskatoon, like even further out west. So what was the response?
So, like, my mom's family was very much against it. Very much against it. So, like, we've just been in Wales for 4 years. That everyone's got their aunties and cousins, and everyone, like my mom and dad both came from big families, so there was a lot of family around. And then all of a sudden, it's like my dad says, I took this job in Canada, and so not knowing anything about Canada, really, the only part he had was that he was hired to be an electrician in a potash mine. Just outside of Saskatoon. And so we came, and when we lived in Saskatoon, it was a very tumultuous time, like, for our family. It was, my mom actually, honestly, she became depressed, and yet she had 2 more children. So now we're up to six children, and yet, and I literally remember coming home from school in Saskatoon, and I come home, and my mom would be crying, and lots, like, for years, and eventually she had to actually be on uppers for, to fight this depression, and so there was just a turmoil in between my mom and dad, like that. We grew up, like, It was frightening sometimes because the level of fighting, and my dad was always a drinker, and so, but yet he was a functional drinker, so he'd still get to work and still kept his job, but it just wasn't conducive to family and a big family. And so we just witnessed, like, a lot of things, like physical fighting between my mom and dad, and my mom wasn't a pushover either. So there would be 2 combatants fighting and stuff, and we were just young, right, and younger than me, and so literally sometimes we would be in our 3 or 4 siblings or something like that. We'd be in our bedroom, like, literally hearing like someone putting their fist through a wall, we were renting, so nothing was stable. Within the first 3 years of living in Canada, we moved 3 different times. So
wow.
literally they were only taking 1 year rental.
Within Saskatoon.
Within Saskatoon,
okay.
all within about 2 or 3 blocks of each other.
Okay.
And so and my dad was just trying to make it, and he worked a ton, like just always. And now we're talking early 80s. And early 80s, there was a huge downturn in our economy, like terrible. Like people were paying 19% for their mortgage rates, and people were walking away from home. So this was
wow.
huge. Yeah.
That's that stock market crash that they were talking about in the 80s. I've heard about it.
Yeah, it would have been that, and honestly, real estate, all those kinds of things. People lost their jobs and just couldn't pay that kind of rate. And so what happened was, my mom and dad actually separated. My mom she just didn't like the culture. She didn't like the weather, and just was so pining for her family, and this wasn't during internet days. Like you didn't. It wasn't quick like it is now. Like
no Skype.
No, and a telephone call was very expensive, and so even more expensive for you when you're not even you got a big family and you're trying to make it.
Yeah.
So those things all play a part. And so literally my mom was really, she said, that's it, I'm done with your drinking, I'm done with your way of life, and literally picked up. So she had 5 kids, sorry if I said 6 because there was still 1 to count. She had 5 kids and left Canada, took us all, and we went back to Wales.
Whoa, okay, so I've got a few questions swimming around in my head. First off, why did she not like Canada? Because Canada is part of the Commonwealth too. So in a way, there are some similarities.
Yeah.
So what did she not like about it?
So good question, because it wasn't as though there was a massive culture shock in the way you live, the way your language, everything was actually fairly similar. It was her family. She missed deeply her own family, and so when you grow up that tight, in a village, and then all of a sudden you're gone, and you're gone halfway around the world. So even for a flight it was crazy.
So expensive.
Yeah. And then I mean the winters. You want to pick a city that's depicts a cold winter in Canada, it would be Saskatoon. I mean, of all the places, I mean, maybe Winnipeg rivals it, maybe Edmonton a bit, but Saskatoon was very cold. And then we didn't even know that. We didn't because we arrived in June. And actually, Saskatoon has beautiful summers, like the clear prairies, blue skies, and long nights, and beautiful sunset, all that, right? And but then winter comes, right? And so that just sort of toppled my mom in regards to just her defense of like, I don't want to be here. And then just depression and all these sorts of things. And my mom was a fighter. There's like, she wasn't a layover or nothing like that. So she picked up 5 kids, and my dad still owned a house in Wales. He never sold the house that we actually lived in.
Okay, so you had 2 homes.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
And and I'm still just a kid, right? I'm still young, and so you just, okay, here we go. We're so we get shuffled around a lot, and I didn't see my dad for probably 18 months.
Wow, that's a long time.
It was a long time.
Yeah.
It was a long time. And in the meantime, when my mom picked up 5 kids and went back to Wales, she was pregnant, probably a couple months, 3 months pregnant with another child. And so this child was born in Wales without my dad being there. And so this was this was a
soul crushing probably for him. I was going to ask,
just,
like, well, how did he take this that she just picked up and left?
Yeah, I mean, how do you work that out as a young kid? Like you're just surviving in a manner, right? And with a big family and everything. And so my mom was like, she was torn, right, between, not having a marriage, but she's with her family in Wales all of a sudden again. But we knew it just wasn't right. And then, so 18 months living in Britain again. Then my dad said, come. So in the 18 months, he actually built a home. He built a house in Saskatoon.
With his bare hands?
With his hands, yeah.
Wow.
He built it. And to this day, they still live in it.
Really?
Yeah, they still live in that house.
Cool.
So, and so he had the foresight. And you know what? Like, he was adamant, like, no, this place is a land of opportunity. This place is a place where, our lineage can succeed here.
Yeah.
And as opposed to Britain, where, I mean, it was just populated, tougher to access, ways for university, for trades. Everything was competing just at a much bigger level because there was just more people.
Yep.
Whereas Canada wasn't like that. There was no lineups almost, right?
Yeah.
It was just, I remember coming to Canada and I was just blown away by just how vast the streets were and just how everyone lived in this. It was almost like a Hollywood scene because, I mean, in Britain, in Wales, you live in very tight quarters.
Yeah.
You live in very small houses and, duplexes almost, or they call them attached houses.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you come to Canada and everyone's just big cars, big space, countryside you could drive for 4 hours and see maybe one or two little towns, which was really bizarre to someone who hasn't known that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anyways, he built a house, and so that was 18 months later. Then my dad, invited my mom for come for a holiday at least.
How did he get her to come back? How did he convince her?
I think he's a family man, and I think he was just so broken with not having everything that he desired, and that was children.
Yeah.
And so I think
and he missed his wife.
Well, yeah. And they didn't divorce. It wasn't
they were
a divorce.
Separated.
They were just countries apart.
Yeah.
And so she went. And she just took two children, one that was just born and then one that was probably 2 years old, and she went on this holiday, and then 6 weeks later we get a call for the rest of the family to come to back to Canada in a new house in a different part of Saskatoon.
In the house he built.
Yeah. And
a complete restoration of the family. Really.
Yeah, it was, and so there, that began my life that was the first. So from that age on, probably about 13, somewhere around there. That time, then we were stable. We never moved again.
Wow.
The family never decided to go elsewhere, and so that was the first time that actually. Wow, we're staying here.
It felt like home.
Yep. It felt like I wasn't, my home's not in Africa, my home's not in Britain, my home's now in Canada.
And what age were you when you felt that?
So probably about 12 or 13 years old. And then to solidify that, became a citizen of Canada.
How long was that process? Not
long, and it wasn't hard because I was still a dependent, so it wasn't like I was getting that as an adult.
Right.
Because when you come from Britain, you're also, because it's a Commonwealth nation, that you get a landed immigrant status, and then so the actual process to to become a citizen wasn't a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Mm.
so yeah. And honestly, I was very proud of being Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like still to this day, I I'm so thankful actually for my dad for having that perseverance and that foresight for his family, and he fought for that, obviously, as you hear, and so I've always loved this country. I think honestly, I think Canada's after being because besides living in these different places, I've traveled lots around the world, and I still always when I return and set my feet on Canadian soil, I'm like, wow, yeah, I'm home, and and I and this is a wonderful nation, a beautiful country, and so I always think that, always, like to this moment, always do, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So one question, I've got again many questions in my head.
Sure, yeah.
And I'll try to remember them all.
Yeah.
But one of them was like, what was the big takeaway from watching your parents go through this? And, you know, I know that you were a young immigrant.
Yeah.
You were just like 5 years old.
Yeah.
Then you were in Zambia. Then you went to Wales until you were 9. And then you came to Canada. So you moved around quite a bit. You were very young.
Yeah.
But you're still an immigrant.
Yeah.
And you're watching, but it's almost like your immigrant story sort of is developed through your parents' story.
Right.
So what are your takeaways from their story? Because, it's just not the same as when, let's say, if you were to immigrate when you were 18, maybe 20.
Sure.
So
probably the biggest thing, and I'll even speak that even to maybe other immigrants who are, you know, listening to this or watching this. The commitment that it took to get to another land, and then actually establish a life in that land was insurmountable. Like honestly, almost impossible, because there's so many fragile things, relationships, or jobs, where you live, economies. Those depends where that happens, that you make it or break it in that sense. And so it was really, I watched my mom and dad, it was really at that tipping point when honestly I can't get much worse than, you know, two parts of the family living in two parts of the world, and honestly what marriage knits itself back together after 18 months. There'd probably be a low percentage, and yet it happened in my family. And so to take out of that immigration, like through my mom and dad, that's what I would, as a character, as my character, I would go, wow, that took a lot of belief, commitment, and then the fortitude and the perseverance, because there would be many days where hopelessness could grip you, or just, you know, I'm done, I give up, and that's it, and then a family's blown apart. So those are very real things. Like, you know, when you think of, I think of these things like what is it? Some of the hardest things to do is moving and a family breakup. Those are the two devastating. I think they're right at the top of the list. And so that was happening in my family. Yeah. And yet they overcame that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, and I can kind of say that now is because, wow, that I watched it unfold, and that was, you know, decades ago. But now I see actually the life I have because of it. Yeah. Like seriously, and I see the life that my sisters have, and their families, and so it's not just looking through my glasses; it's also theirs too, and now we're a family that I think there's like 23 grandchildren from my mom and dad, and obviously spouses, and so this family constellation has gotten big.
Yeah,
and
of course.
And has survived. Like they all got good marriages, and that kind of living as well. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Honestly, like,
yeah,
you don't hear many stories like this, unfortunately, nowadays.
Yeah.
So that's really incredible to hear that, and it gives you so many life lessons.
Sure does.
Impresses so many things on you, young kids.
Yeah.
And like, my hat's off to your parents, honestly.
Yeah. Truly.
The other thing I wanted to ask about is your dad. You said he had this foresight.
Yeah.
But it's almost like believing for the things that are not yet there, the things that are unseen.
Right.
So how did he have that faith?
Yeah, because he certainly wasn't a religious man. My dad's not a religious man, so it wasn't from, from a supernatural, savior, I guess. It was, I think it was just a sight line that he knew within himself that that this would happen, and that I can overcome this. So, and I think you see that a lot in people who come from other countries. They have to have that. What would you call it? That part of their character of like, we are going to establish roots here, and we are going to make it. I would say that's the sort of the mandate of many immigrants, no matter what country they've come from or where they're, or what struggles. That would be, I would think, a common trait that they would have to, because there'd be so many things against them, right? Is they've losing their culture, losing language perhaps, and coming to a brand new land, and then also is watching their own children grow up in a different culture, as opposed to wanting to hang on to this one that they came from. So there's that huge struggle too, right? Well, there's that assimilation, or the struggle with assimilation is like, how much do we keep of the old, and how much do we embrace of the new, and how can we even intermingle both? And very, very cool. Like I ended up, just to bring this in, like as I grew up, I ended up marrying a First Nations woman, which was remarkable, really. I was just like, I was blown away, really. Like, this colonial British Isles, family comes, and then actually, and this woman I married, her mom and dad came out of residential schools in Saskatchewan. And so, man, you just got this, real conflict, really. I mean, it's, if I can say, the colonial people put a lot of the First Nations people in that situation. And yet I'm married and blended to these, like, really diverse cultures and beliefs, really. And yet we came to faith in Jesus Christ. I'll just be flat out with that. And so we walk a line a little differently than just sort of our humanity. We got to survive, and we got to make it. Now we look to God as sovereign and wonderful, and He is our maker, and He is our reason we live. So that's what's come for me. That's crazy, and I never even put two and two together, because I met your wife. And I knew her background, but I knew of it, I should say. I don't know the whole story, but I knew her background. And I didn't even put two to two together that, yes, you came from Britain or United Kingdom? What can we say? UK.
Both?
UK. A lot of people.
UK?
UK. You can say both.
Okay, so you came from UK. And she's First Nations here in Canada. And I didn't even think about, like,
Sure.
whoa, the history,
Sure.
the long history that
Sure.
dates back.
And man, this is like, yeah. I mean, the very thing, like, I remember marrying my wife, and there was such a difference that we didn't even have a white wedding. We eloped.
Okay.
So that our families didn't have to get in the middle of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so we literally left and told no one. I actually, even as we got married, we had to hire witnesses. Like, we had to pay witnesses. Like, we phoned a commissioner to marry us on a cliff in British Columbia. And literally the lady says, "Do you have any witnesses?" I said, my wife said, "No, we don't." And so she goes, "I'll bring my husband and I'll bring my mom." And so we paid them $75 each. That's just what it was. And so two cultures were colliding, and we kind of knew that. And yet, and it was years really before my wife's mother would accept this union. She did in a polite sense, but not in a
real from the heart.
Not in a depth, right? And I remember just sort of, breaking through with my mother-in-law and just going, all I'll do is love your wife. I mean, your daughter. And I will do her well. And so I think that's what started to break that, because there was colonialism, and rightly so in my mother and father-in-law's kind of way, because man, they had to, their people, the First Nations people, were reeling from their culture taken and being conquered, and their life taken away from them. So it's another layer of like.
That's another layer of Canada.
It is another layer of like, honestly, and I didn't mention this before, but as a young boy, so when I finally stayed in Canada, even as a 14 and 15-year-old, young teenager, it was as though I knew I was going to marry a First Nations woman. And I'm 14, so I mean, who even is thinking of marriage, right?
Yeah.
So any girls I dated, any relationships I had, which were many. I don't want to paint that as like a pathway of women. It wasn't that at all. We're all First Nations. And then my wife, obviously, and then even the way I had to get married to her in eloping, and so it was so neat to, I thank my dad once again for coming to this nation, because I get this life.
Yeah.
Like, I honestly, and it still is wonderful. It's still unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it still is. Like, I'm plateaued. And a very neat thing happened too. It's like, I'm an arborist. So if you don't know what an arborist is, it's like a lumberjack. So I climb trees. We run our own business, and then in the off season for years, I was a Zamboni driver. And if you don't know what a Zamboni driver is, that's the machine that goes around and
on the ice.
Cleans ice.
Yeah.
So I literally phoned my dad one day and I said, "Well, Dad, I'm fully Canadian. I drive a Zamboni in the winter and I'm a lumberjack in the summer." And it was just like this fullness of being Canadian. And so I love this nation, like, and like, I still love my family, and they're all in Britain and stuff. No one ever left, actually. It was only my dad that emigrated out of this little village, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the opportunities, and then for my own children as well, and so I see that from what my mom and dad did. I'm very thankful and full of gratitude for a pathway to take. Absolutely. Yeah.
What I think is really neat here is the fact that you're not just speaking about Canada from an immigrant's perspective and just what you see and what you've experienced here, but you actually married a First Nations woman and you learned about Canada on an even deeper level, which I have to say that I don't, at least for myself, I can only speak for myself. I don't really know too much about the First Nations, unfortunately. I know bits and pieces, but I don't really know about the culture or the history. And in a way, it's kind of sad for me because I live here and I'm not taking the time to learn more about this. So I really appreciate how you're basically telling us how it is, and you're exposing another side to Canada that many probably wouldn't think of.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's very true. Because so my wife is Cree Plains First Nations from Saskatchewan, and so my kids, I got 4 kids. They're actually also status First Nations. So wow, I'm just like that's bizarre too. It's like my lineage is actually come through my wife as well, right? And so it's like. And I remember coming to Canada, and so this is in the, we're talking late 70s, early 80s, and it wasn't, if I can speak candidly, it wasn't good to be First Nations. There was just a lot of racism. There was just a lot of, there was a class distinction, all sorts of things. And I remember where we grew up first, in Saskatoon. We were in a low rental neighborhood there for the first 3 years, and it was just like, boy, we would see the First Nations people also in that cycle, and I always remember like, wow, and yet I was intrigued by the First Nations people, and yet I knew they were hurting and helpless. And so even now as an adult, I am drawn to First Nations people, probably through my wife somewhat, but also just myself, like hitchhiking. Like I live not far from a highway, so it's always, it's always First Nations people who are trying to get back to the reserve from the city, and it's just like, yeah, come on in, jump in, we'll get you home. And so there's definitely been a deeper understanding through the First Nations people for my own Canadianness, absolutely. And so we go on reserves, and we've taught in schools, about hope and about love and about grace and mercy and trying to lend a hand. And so it's pretty cool as a white Caucasian British subject that I actually get access into some of these places, and especially through my in-laws' families and stuff. So yeah, you're bang on about it being a deeper sort of, insight into Canada. Yeah, it is.
And I'm just thinking way back into the 1800s. What your marriage is like when you had the British come over, and then you had the First Nations people here in Canada. I imagine that there would be lots of marriages. So you were kind of experiencing what the people first experienced when they came to Canada. And that's a really cool experience, quite honestly.
And you know what? Like, I remember, so when each one of our children were born, our blood was so different. My wife's and mine were so different that each one of our children, every one of them, had to be incubated for this blood to actually mix properly.
Even on a physical level?
I'm talking physical level.
Wow.
So even that's how different our culture, our nations, our people group are, and yet there was a union.
Wow, that's mind blowing.
Yeah, it's neat, and as a believer in Christ, I mean, we see that so much further. We see that deeper as well, right? Like, and it is another reason I love Canada. It's like this multiculturalism, right? Like, there's pockets of Africans and Middle East and Europeans and Asians, you know, and yet this is a society that actually embraces, you know, immigration, and yet there is an ugly underside and underbelly of, you know, we were here first, or all this kinds of stuff, and yet it's a very young nation. This is not an old land. It's 153 years old. And honestly, who was here first? It was the First Nation.
Yeah.
And so I see a great awakening and a redemption coming to the First Nations people as well. I pray for them and healing, definitely healing in their way, but it's coming. It's coming. I see that.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
So to wrap up here.
Yeah.
Thinking back to when you were 5 and you're moving around a lot, and your parents are going through these struggles, and your dad still has this foresight of this life, this potential life that he and his family could have. Do you have any regrets? Are there any regrets?
No, I don't think there's regrets, because definitely the way my life is now, I think, was born out of my dad. And I speak specifically to my dad because he was the guy that was always dreaming of somewhere else and going somewhere else. So he formed something deep inside me too, to go and visit other lands. Now, I don't live in other lands. We haven't done that part, you know, but we've been as almost like missionaries, been to so many nations that I think that was born out of my mom and dad showing me different cultures, showing me a whole different way of life. And so that desire to also know that and see that has been built into my adult life.
Yeah.
And through that, all my children have actually seen many different cultures. You know, we've lived at orphanages in Mexico. You know, we've been to South Pacific and served and stuff. And so that was all, I believe, was seeded in me as I grew up.
Yeah.
There, probably the biggest regret, if there is one, was alcohol, like with my father. Yeah, I mean, that was his coping, and it's not a good coping mechanism. So I thank my mom deeply. Thank you, Mom, because she was just a faithful woman of marriage, and of belief in God. And so, if it wasn't for her sort of grace and forgiveness, I guess, then this whole family would have been blown apart.
Right.
And none of this, I wouldn't even be here, all that kind of stuff. And so now my mom and dad, they celebrate 55 years of marriage.
Wow, that's incredible.
Years of marriage, right? And so that's the testimony out of it. But yet there were so many like wreckages that could have happened through this immigration, through this coping mechanism, alcoholism and alcohol. And so even to this day, I keep the alcohol and any addictions that want to kind of come. It's like I keep that very much at arm's length because it stole a lot of time.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the regret of it. It stole time from my dad with me, my dad with my sisters. That's how I see alcohol. It's like, you know, it's got other destructive properties, but time was the one that the main one. And so maybe I'm speaking to some immigrants, you know, who are here now and are having a real tough time. That I just say, you know, like, watch what you turn to, You know what I mean? Like if there's a watch what you escape to. It's a warning in the matter, so that you don't lose the very thing that you came here to try and build.
Yeah.
And that's serious stuff. That's because if you let yourself go down a road too far, there's no return because the wreckage that has happened. And so yeah, that's my life. I hope it's an encouragement to you, and I hope that you see Canada in a light that brings opportunity and hope to your family. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you, Gavin.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. Yeah. It was very inspiring for me, at least, and I learned a lot too, truly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing your story today.
Yeah, and I thank you too. Like, I thank you that you're doing this segment of immigration, because I think it will encourage not just people who are immigrants, but people who have been here for a long time, for generations, to understand maybe the fight that it takes to establish a family here in a different nation coming from somewhere else. So thank you for doing this as well.
Thank you. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this episode. If you want to continue watching more inspiring immigrant stories, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Spotify. Also, Immigrants of Canada is financially fueled by wonderful people like you. And so if you feel led to donate, please visit www.immigrantsofcanada.com/donate. Thank you.